It began without warning. Or at least, that's how it seemed to those asleep inside the palace walls. In truth, the betrayal had been set in motion weeks earlier, orders whispered to trusted captains, supply caches hidden in cellars near the palace, guard rotations studied until a weakness appeared. On the evening of the Spring Moon Festival, when lanterns floated in the capital's rivers and music drifted through the streets, the general's loyalists made their move. The disappearing guard just past midnight, the heir's personal guard noticed something odd. 2 entire squads had not reported for their shift change. When replacements were sent to check, they found the barracks doors unbarred, the bunks empty, and the weapons racks bare. Before a report could reach the heir, the palace's main gates slammed shut from the outside, the iron bolts dropped into place by men wearing the dynasty's own colors. From the southern wall, horns blew. But instead of the deep call used to signal an alarm, it was the sharp triple note of a rally, the general's signal. The first clash within minutes, the palace erupted in chaos. The loyalists moved with surgical precision, seizing the armories first, then the stables, cutting off any chance of escape. Servants ran through the corridors, their silk robes whispering on the stone, carrying conflicting orders. One moment, word spread that the general had come to protect the heir from an assassination plot. The next, that the heir had ordered the general's arrest. No one knew which was true, and in the confusion, men fought their own comrades in the flickering light of oil lamps. The heir, roused from sleep by the sound of steel on steel, dressed in his ceremonial armor, not because it offered protection, but because he knew that if this was his end, he would meet it as a prince of the dynasty. The confrontation in the Hall of Ancestral Banners, the heir and the general met once again. The air was thick with smoke from a toppled brazier, and the golden dragon banners rippled in the hot drafts of fire. Outside, the fighting raged, but inside it was almost quiet, the silence between 2 men who had once trusted each other with their lives. The heir's voice was low but steady. "You swore an oath to my father." The general's reply came without hesitation. "I swore an oath to the Empire. And you will destroy it." Neither man raised his weapon. They didn't need to. Outside the hall, the outcome was already decided. The fall of the capital by the second hour before dawn, the palace was in loyalist hands. The emperor, frail and unable to stand, was taken into protective custody. The heir, stripped of his sword, was escorted through the corridors where portraits of his ancestors looked down in silent judgment. The general's soldiers lined the route, their eyes averted. In the city beyond the palace walls, the people woke to the sound of horns. At first, many believed it was the announcement of a foreign victory. Then they saw the banners, the crimson dragon still flew, but beside it hung the general's personal standard, black with a silver wolf. The moment the oath broke, historians mark a single image as the moment the dynasty truly fell, the general stepping into the emperor's audience chamber, kneeling only briefly before taking the throne's footstep. It was not a coronation, not yet, but it was the breaking of the unspoken rule that had kept the empire whole for half a millennium, that no man but the heir of the dragon could stand at the heart of power. The banners still hung. The drums still beat. But the empire had changed hands in the space of a single night. Closing hook for next section by sunrise, the coup was complete. No foreign army had crossed the borders. No natural disaster had struck the capital. The dynasty had been undone by one of its own, not in a battlefield's roar, but in the quiet betrayal of a sworn oath. The next chapter would not be about the taking of power, but the shattering of a civilization, the fall of the dragon banner. The heir to the throne was not born into a quiet court. From the moment of his first breath, palace scribes were already recording his life for history. His cradle rested under a silk canopy embroidered with the dynasty's crimson dragon, and from childhood he was taught that his veins carried not just blood, but the will of heaven itself. His tutors drilled him in history, philosophy, and the art of governance. The emperor, his father, believed a ruler should be as skilled with words as with the sword, so the boy was also trained in horsemanship, archery, and the intricate military formations that had brought the dynasty its greatest victories. By his mid-20s, the heir had earned a reputation among the people for his compassion and his sharp mind. He toured the provinces not in a gilded carriage, but on horseback, speaking with farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. His speeches carried a dangerous promise, that when he ascended, reforms would sweep through the empire like a cleansing tide. The common people adored him for it. The court, less so. The general who won the empire twice over in another part of the realm, far from the marble corridors of the capital, a man of a different kind was rising. The general, older than the heir by a decade, had earned his name in the crucible of war. His first campaign had been a defensive battle in the mountain passes, where his unconventional use of fire traps and collapsing ridges saved the capital from a sudden invasion. His second great triumph was on the western frontier, where he turned a hopeless retreat into a crushing victory by luring his enemies into the narrow valley locals called the Wolf's Maw. By the time our story begins, the general's name was spoken with reverence by soldiers and with a mix of fear and respect by the court. He was the embodiment of martial excellence, disciplined, decisive, and fiercely loyal, at least outwardly, to the throne. The bond forged in war. The heir and the general first met during a border campaign in the southern marshlands. The heir, sent by his father to learn war, found himself in a skirmish that could have ended his life. The general personally led the rescue that pulled the young prince from the chaos. That moment, retold by campfire storytellers for years, was the spark of a bond that would shape the empire's fate. Over the next 5 years, they worked together on multiple campaigns, their victories turning into festivals in the capital. To the public, they were the perfect duo, the wise prince and the invincible general. Paintings showed them riding side by side into battle, banners streaming overhead. Poets likened them to the twin stars that guided travelers through the desert night. Rival visions for the empire, but beneath the surface, cracks began to form. The heir dreamed of reform, reducing the military's grip on politics, cutting corruption from the bureaucracy, and easing the tax burden on the provinces. The general, though no lover of corruption, believed the empire's survival depended on absolute military supremacy and feared that reform would weaken the realm at a time when foreign powers circled like wolves. At first, these differences emerged in private debates, quiet, respectful, even affectionate. But the court's ever-watchful eyes saw opportunity. Ministers whispered in the heir's ear that the general's growing popularity was dangerous. Officers in the general's camp warned him that the heir was too soft, too willing to dismantle the army's influence. The parade of masks one spring morning, the capital erupted in celebration. Victory banners lined the streets as the heir and the general returned from yet another successful campaign. The parade was a spectacle, drums thundered, flowers rained down from balconies, and the people roared the names of both men. Yet in the high balconies above the rout, courtiers watched with narrowed eyes. Some noted that the cheers for the general seemed louder than those for the heir. Others saw the way the general's soldiers saluted him first and the heir second. The seeds of paranoia had been sown, and the soil was fertile. Closing hook for next section. In that moment of triumph, neither man could see how close they stood to the precipice. To the crowd, they were heroes. To the court, they were threats, each to the other, and both to the balance of power. From here, the story moves into shadow. The drums will fade, the flowers will rot, and in the dim corridors of the palace, the first whispers of betrayal will take root. The palace at night was a different world. By day, the marble corridors rang with the clatter of sandals, the hum of petitioners, and the clang of bronze gates opening to admit foreign envoys. By night, the sounds changed, the soft scrape of slippers on polished floors, the faint hiss of oil lamps, and the muffled murmur of voices in shadowed alcoves. It was in this darkness that the real battles of the empire were fought, battles of words, of glances, of silence. The factions in play for decades, the court had been a delicate balance between civilian bureaucrats and military leaders. The emperor, now in his later years, no longer commanded the same attention he once did. His frailty created a power vacuum, and in that void, factions sharpened their knives. One camp, led by the chancellor, favored the heir. They saw in him the promise of reforms that would return dominance to the civil administration. The other camp, composed of veteran generals and provincial governors, threw their weight behind the war hero whose victories had kept the empire's enemies at bay. Each side claimed loyalty to the dynasty, but loyalty in the palace was often a mask for ambition. The first seeds of conspiracy it began subtly. The chancellor arranged private audiences with the heir, where reports of the general's growing influence were delivered in careful, measured tones. The general's allies countered by sending letters, intercepted by no one but trusted writers, warning him that the heir's talk of reform was really a plan to strip the army of its authority. At first, both men dismissed the rumors. They had fought beside each other, shared the same firelit tents, and bled on the same battlefields. But words repeated often enough have a way of reshaping memory. A hesitation in the other's voice became suspicion. A delayed message became evidence of deceit. The meeting that changed everything one night, in the hall of ancestral banners, the heir and the general met in private. The hall was lit only by flickering braziers, the shadows of ancient battle flags swaying on the walls. What was meant as a discussion became an argument. The heir spoke of easing the burden on the provinces, the general warned that such weakness would invite foreign invasion. Neither raised his voice, yet every sentence landed like a blow. When they parted, their handshake lingered a moment too long, not in warmth, but in calculation. The latter days later, a courier arrived at the general's residence under cover of darkness. He carried a sealed letter bearing the imperial crest. No one knows exactly what it said. Historians debate whether it was a direct order, a warning, or a trap, but from that night on, the general's movements changed. His visits to the palace grew less frequent. His most loyal officers were quietly reassigned to the capital. And in the barracks, soldiers began speaking in lowered voices, as if sensing the wind had shifted. Closing hook for next section, the whispers had become a chorus. The palace was now a stage where every nod, every pause, every word carried double meaning. The drums of war were silent, but in the corridors of power, another kind of battle had begun, one that would break not just trust, but the empire itself. Next comes the night when those whispers erupt into steel and blood, the night of the broken oath. Dawn broke over the capital with a strange stillness. The streets, so often filled with the bustle of merchants and the laughter of children, lay silent. The crimson dragon still fluttered from the palace towers, but now it hung beside the black and silver wolf of the general, a pairing that told the city everything without a single proclamation. By midday, word had spread to every corner of the realm. The heir had been taken into custody, the emperor confined to his private quarters, and the general had assumed the temporary stewardship of the empire. To those who knew history, there was no such thing as temporary. The purge, the first act of the new order, was swift and merciless. Within hours, the chancellor and the most senior civil officials loyal to the heir were arrested. Some were executed publicly at the western gate, their heads displayed on iron spikes as a warning. Others simply vanished into the dungeons beneath the palace, their fates left to rumor. Provincial governors were summoned to the capital to renew their oaths. Those who hesitated were replaced by the general's allies, men whose loyalty had been tested on the battlefield rather than in the court. In less than a month, the civil bureaucracy that had administered the empire for centuries was gutted, replaced by a military council that answered only to the general. The ripple of fear moved faster than the fastest courier. In the provinces, nobles burned correspondence linking them to the old regime. Merchants quietly shifted their trade routes to avoid offending the new order. Even in the far-flung borderlands, where the news took weeks to arrive, soldiers sensed the change in the wind. Some defected to the general's banner before any messenger arrived, hoping to prove their loyalty before suspicion could take root. The heir's fate remained a mystery. Some whispered he had been sent into exile under guard, others, that he had been executed in secret to prevent rebellion. The general said nothing, and his silence was its own message. The empire unravels. The coup had secured the capital, but beyond the heartland, the empire began to fray. Tribute from allied states slowed as rival rulers tested the general's resolve. In the north, an opportunistic invasion by a long-standing enemy captured 2 border fortresses before reinforcements could arrive. In the east, trade guilds refused to pay their full taxes, citing unsettled conditions. The general's government responded with force, but each new campaign drained the treasury and bled the army. What had been a united realm under the dragon banner was now a patchwork of fiefdoms and contested territories. The human cost for the people, the betrayal meant hunger, displacement, and fear. Soldiers patrolled the streets of the capital, their armor bearing the wolf's crest. Festivals honoring the dynasty were cancelled. The old songs, once sung in the marketplaces, were now whispered only in private, like prayers for a world that no longer existed. The dynasty had not yet vanished from the chronicles, but in the hearts of its people, it was already gone. Closing hook for final section. From the outside, the banners still flew and the palaces still stood. But the soul of the empire, the belief that it would last forever, had been shattered. The final chapter would belong not to armies or rulers, but to history itself, the lesson carved in ashes. History records the fall of the dynasty in the language of dates and decrees, but the truth was more fragile, more human. It was not a single night's coup that destroyed an empire of 5 centuries, it was the slow erosion of trust, the hardening of ambition, and the failure to see that the walls of the realm were crumbling from within. In the decades that followed, chroniclers argued over the betrayal's cause. Some blamed the general, calling him a traitor who traded honor for power. Others accused the heir, saying his idealism threatened the empire's survival in a dangerous age. A few, perhaps the most honest, concluded that the dynasty's fate had been sealed long before either man drew breath, that no dynasty, however glorious, escapes the decay of time. Echoes through the ages. The fall of the dragon banner became a touchstone for future rulers. In later centuries, generals who grew too popular were recalled or reassigned before they could build independent power. Heirs were taught to temper their visions with caution, to avoid alienating the very forces meant to guard the throne. But these lessons were learned too late for the empire that inspired them. Archaeologists today still find traces of the dynasty's grandeur, fragments of jade ornaments, inscriptions praising emperors long forgotten, and, in rare cases, whole banners buried in ceremonial tombs. The crimson silk has faded, but the coiled dragon can still be seen if the light strikes it just right, a ghost of a symbol that once ruled the world. The weight of betrayal. The true legacy of that night is not in the lands lost or the throne seized, but in the enduring truth it revealed, that betrayal from within is the most devastating weapon an empire can face. No fortress wall is high enough, no army large enough, to defend against the breaking of an oath in the heart of its own command. Closing image and hook. One final story survives in the folklore of the provinces, of an old soldier who, years after the coup, returned to the capital and found the dynasty's banner discarded in a marketplace stall, sold for a handful of copper coins. He bought it, carried it to a hill outside the city, and burned it at sunset, saying only, "Better the wind carry its ashes than the hands of the unworthy bear its weight." And so the dragon flew one last time, on a wind that carried its story far beyond the borders of the fallen realm, into the realm of legend, where betrayal and glory are forever intertwined. 500 years before the night of betrayal, the dynasty was not yet a dynasty, it was a desperate dream. It began on a windswept plain under the shadow of a red-tinged sunrise, when a warlord with no name in history books yet stood before an army of only a few hundred men. His enemies numbered in the thousands. The air smelled of frost and iron. By dusk, the warlord would be known as the founder of an empire. His name, now etched into temple walls, coins, and the prayers of generations, became synonymous with conquest. Historians debate whether his rise was the product of genius, ruthlessness, or sheer luck, but the result was undeniable. A fractured land of rival tribes and city-states was forged into a single, unshakable realm. Through the crack of shields and the roar of war drums, the dynasty's foundation was laid. The machinery of power from those bloody beginnings came an empire whose very heartbeat was the army. The dynasty perfected military organization, regiments drilled year-round, cavalry trained to move like a single living creature, and an officer corps chosen not only by birth but by skill on the battlefield. The founders' reforms ensured loyalty. Soldiers swore oaths not just to the throne but to the dynasty's sacred banner, a crimson emblem bearing the coiled dragon. Outside the battlefield, the dynasty built an administrative web that stretched across mountains, rivers, and deserts. Roads carved through stone carried messengers faster than any rival could match. Grain taxes from the fertile river valleys sustained the armies through endless campaigns. Law was strict but predictable. A peasant in the northern hills could appeal to the same code of justice as a merchant in the southern ports. This combination of iron military discipline and bureaucratic precision created stability so enduring that, 5 centuries later, commoners still told stories of the founders' law with a kind of awe, as if the man himself might walk through the market at any moment. The cultural glue. Yet it was not only war and law that held the dynasty together. The ruling house understood that an empire needed identity. They sponsored poets, philosophers, and artisans, weaving a golden tapestry of culture that became the pride of the people. Grand temples rose in the capital, their pillars carved with the exploits of past rulers. Festivals celebrated the victories of ancestors, turning historical events into living memory. The dynasty positioned itself as not merely a political entity but a divine order, a link between the heavens and the earth. The belief was simple but powerful: as long as the dynasty stood, the sun would rise and the rivers would flow. To defy the throne was to invite cosmic chaos. The illusion of permanence. By the dawn of its 5th century, the dynasty appeared eternal. Its borders had swelled and contracted with time, but always the heartland remained untouched, a symbol of resilience. Foreign envoys bowed in the capital, offering tribute from distant lands. Merchants carried silks, spices, and rare metals along trade routes that pulsed like the veins of a giant. The people could not imagine a world without their rulers, for to them, the dynasty was the world. But stability breeds complacency, and in the palaces of marble and jade, the signs of decay had already begun. The bureaucracy had swollen to a lumbering beast, consuming wealth faster than it generated. Provincial governors, far from the capital, began to act as kings in their own right, their loyalty more symbolic than sincere. The army, once the blade of the empire, was now split between veteran warriors and political appointees more skilled in court intrigue than in war. And yet, to the common eye, the facade held. Parades of soldiers still marched through the streets on holy days. The emperor's proclamation still rang with divine authority. The crimson dragon still flew over every fortress and city gate. Foreshadowing the fall, it is here, in the calm before the storm, that our story plants its first shadow. A whisper in a marketplace about a general's ambition. A glance exchanged between 2 officials in a dimly lit corridor. A rider arriving at night from the borderlands with news he dare not speak aloud in the open. The dynasty, for all its glory, was a vessel heavy with cracks. The betrayal that would end it all was not a sudden thunderclap but the slow tightening of a noose, invisible to those basking in the glow of tradition and history. The final golden years in these last decades before collapse, the dynasty experienced what historians later called the second bloom, a sudden flourishing of art, architecture, and scholarship. Palaces were expanded, canals repaired, libraries filled with rare manuscripts from across the known world. To the people, it felt like the empire was entering a new age of greatness. But to those who watched closely, the bloom was a mask. Behind the celebrations, the throne grew more isolated. The emperor's reliance on a handful of advisors, some from the military, some from the court, created rival camps, each hungry for dominance. The heir to the throne, beloved by the people, became a pawn in the struggle for influence. And among the generals, one man rose with victories so decisive that the people began to cheer his name in the streets, a dangerous thing in a realm where loyalty was meant to belong only to the dragon banner. Closing hook for next section. Our story now stands on the knife's edge. For half a millennium, the dynasty had outlived plagues, invasions, and civil wars. Yet its fate would not be decided by a foreign enemy or natural disaster, but by a betrayal born in its own heart. The next act belongs to two men, one bound by blood to rule, the other bound by loyalty to serve, and how their bond would become the spark that set a 500-year empire aflame.